Well, thank you, Chad. It's also a particular pleasure for me to go after Chad because I don't have to worry about remembering to raising the microphone. But it's also, it's great to be back at the Peterson Institute. And actually, even though the topic today is rearmament and sort of at least war-related issues, actually broadly good news from, if you like, boring, old, predictable Europe. So I want to talk a little bit about the reasons for why Europe is suddenly rearming. What is the feasibility and what are the challenges? And then finally, as also Adam alluded to in the beginning, a little bit about the implications. And here, what is it that we need to achieve in Europe? And again, I want to emphasize that you need to make an important distinction between the EU and Europe as a whole. Because one of the things I'm going to argue here is actually that this rearmament drive is going to be extraordinarily good for broader EU collaboration, not just broader European collaboration between EU members and other European countries. Then I want to talk a little bit about what has been done, and then in good Leninist fashion ask what is to be done still, and the implications of that for the rest of Europe. So why now, right? And there I really think it's important to recognize that from a European point of view, sitting in Brussels, this is a two-front confrontation. Obviously, we've had a war in Ukraine going on for now over 3 years, but also, and the more recent issue is, of course, a very palpable sense of loss of trust in the traditional US security guarantee provided through NATO. In that sense, as I said here, maybe not all of Europe, but certainly most of Europe are all Gaullists now. And that's a pretty big shift. And it's also important, I think, to recognize that going forward, as Europeans are planning their defense expenditures, they actually are planning today on a potential Russian testing of Article 5 over the next not that many years. So it really is a combination of Trump and Putin that has prompted this fairly historical shift. So, then the question is, what is it Europe needs to do? Well, Europe needs to be able, in principle, to deter Russia without the assistance of the United States. Is that possible? I would certainly argue absolutely yes. And I think the key thing, the starting point here is to understand, and that is what this chart does. It has, defense spending as a share of GDP and gross government debt on the x-axis, and the size of the bubbles are GDP, the size of the economies. Russia is not the Soviet Union, right? Russia is an economy the size of Spain and Italy together, with a population roughly, the combined of Germany and France put together. So it's absolutely doable. Meanwhile, on the European side, this time around, if you might say, unlike obviously during the Cold War, we have a very large, currently fielded Ukrainian army that's actually, we can talk about that during the Q&A, but actually is doing not too badly against Russian assaults over the last 3 years. I would go from a military point of view, the old Red Army, this large arsenal of tens of thousands of tanks and other stuff, has been annihilated. It doesn't exist anymore. It has been destroyed. So what it means is that in economic and also military terms, even what I would argue a coalition of the willing, and that's what I tried to allude to here in the chart with the so-called Northern Alliance, which is basically the Nordics, the Baltics, the Poles, the Germans, and the Dutch put together, would be able to deter Russia going forward, provided that Ukraine prevails or actually continues to exist as a independent state. So what is Europe's problem, if you like, or challenge from a military production point of view here? Well, that is the bang for the buck, if you can use that expression here. It's really about getting the military purchasing power parity, if you like, up. And the chart here on the left is really an attempt done by a number of academics trying to sort of PPP adjust the regular defense budgets relative to the United States. And what you can see is that Russia and Ukraine at the top are really the ones that have far higher PPPs. You get a lot more for your money there. This is what you can also see on the chart on your right, which is a plot of the per unit price and the annual production numbers of self-propelled howitzers, sort of the type of artillery guns that you use in Ukraine. And the bottom line here is that in the bottom right corner is the Ukrainian Bogdana, which is far cheaper to produce and is being produced in far larger numbers than any other howitzer. So the challenge to do this, if you want to increase your military purchasing power, is you need to obviously research and development. Well, if you've got an ongoing war, that's a pretty good laboratory because you can test your products right away. You obviously need low cost. Well, Ukraine has that. And then you need production numbers. So Europe's challenge here really continues to be this sort of military version of the collective action problem, that it needs to get to a common EU defense procurement process. We can't have 7 different tanks and 10 different armored personnel carriers, etc. But the good news here again is I would argue that Ukraine will be very useful for the EU here as well, because Ukraine will offer both a low-cost production location, and it will certainly offer a scale more broadly. And it is not just in the current drone production that this will play a role. So again, when it comes to scaling up military production in Europe, I would argue that Ukraine is the key to success. So what has Europe done to date? Well, the first one I think is Europe has supported and will continue to support Ukraine militarily, financially, and diplomatically. And I think it's important here to recognize that from a European point of view, the reason this will continue, irrespective of what the Trump administration does, is that no deal, aka continued war, is far better than a bad deal from a European point of view. And this is also true for Ukraine to date. Then Europe continues on a bilateral basis, individual member states. This, by the way, the Biden administration did it too. The Trump guys don't do it, but directly support military production in Ukraine, basically paying Ukrainian military manufacturers to produce weapons for the battlefield. This is a very possible to scale that up. So actually, even today, Ukraine is already, as I write, I just checked the numbers after this, that Ukraine is already today the largest military producer in Europe. And upon full EU membership, it'll probably be among the largest military producers in the world. Then clearly a number of member states have announced already significant increases in defense expenditures. Most of Northern Europe, 3.5% on average, including this very large recent one in Germany, or I would call it epoch-defining. And then we have an announcement by the European Commission, this 800 billion headline. I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that. It's not the final product, really. It's basically an assumption of agglomerating additional national defense expenditure. So I wouldn't put too much in that. The real question is, what is still to be done? One, clearly, we're going to have continued, most defense expenditures in Europe will remain national, but there will be, and this is the design discussions right now, about a new institutional mechanism to be designed. And as I said earlier, this will be a coalition of the willing. This won't be the EU. It may not even be all of the EU, because maybe Hungary decide not to join. But it will certainly also have to include the UK, Norway, possibly others. You could imagine even the Canadians or others wanting to join. So the specifics institutional design, as I said, remains to be seen. But the key point is you need to identify specific military needs that can be solved together, and then you fund them, not the other way around. Not Eurobonds first, but military needs and then funding. Very, very high levels of uncertainty. We don't know what the dominant technologies coming out of Ukraine will be, and we don't know the full extent of current US military capabilities that Europe may want to fully replicate. And that is particularly relevant with sort of intelligence gathering, satellites, etc. But the end product of this, whether it's a bank or if it's a special purpose vehicle of another type of institution, is, I believe, that you will have a grant-based multi-year vehicle big enough to incentivize private sector investment over a decade. And that means we're talking about over a 10-year horizon, somewhere between 200 and 250 billion euros over the next 10 years. That is what will this mean fiscally, the broader rearmament issue? Well, it will, as this chart shows. This chart is basically just the current primary balances from last year, and then added to them the gap so that each member state can reach this sort of informal target that Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, put out of 3.7% defense expenditure. Where would that have put these countries? And what you can see is that it would put nearly everybody into significant deficits. But it's also clear that most of Northern Europe would absolutely be able to do that, including, of course, Germany. And they have announced that they will do it, and they will go ahead and do it and simply increase debt as a result of that. I think we should also expect, because of the uncertainty that I mentioned earlier, a lot of this defense expenditure will be backloaded. We simply don't know yet precisely what to invest in. But nonetheless, because the emphasis in Europe, where traditionally at least 50% of equipment has been purchased in the United States, that will drop very significantly, maybe not to a zero, but certainly a lot. So the overall fiscal multiplier over the years from this, I think, should be expected to be in the higher range, maybe even as high as 1, maybe even higher than that for some countries. On the other hand, I would argue that this rearmament is not going to have particularly big monetary and inflationary expectations, so it will not be offset by the ECB. And then finally, what will it mean? As I said, two-front challenge will really facilitate collaboration between EU and non-EU members, although recent events in Turkey means that we don't quite know where Turkey fits in. I think it will mean that Ukraine is more likely to get into the EU as a full member by 2030 than much later. And it's also worth noting that if that happens, by the time Ukraine becomes a member of the EU, it will be among the largest arms producers in the world. It will have a very, very capable and very, very large army. So at that point in time, the EU, I know it sounds crazy today, but the EU will actually be a material, meaningful military force put together with Ukraine. Clearly, these ongoing defense needs, as well as funding needs for Ukraine, will mean that Eurobond issuance will continue. There won't be any early repayment of next generation EU and these types of things. And then, finally, as Adam mentioned, the fact that the EU itself is now beginning to take on more and more defense-related capabilities or tasks will mean that the state formation process of the EU will accelerate further going forward. So with that, if we can debate whether that's good news or bad news, but anyway, those are the news. So thank you very much.